Okay, so for everyone who has just joined, welcome to the Quincy Institute's panel today, Strategic Patience, Sustainable Engagement with a Changed Afghanistan. If you don't know about the Quincy Institute, we're a DC-based think tank that promotes a more diplomacy-based and less militaristic approach to U.S. foreign policy. And we have quite the lineup today to talk about the future of U.S. policy in Afghanistan and also lessons learned from the past. So excuse me if I read from some notes because I don't want to miss anything from their bios. We have Graham Smith, who's a senior consultant for the International Crisis Group, and he has 9 years of on-the-ground experience in Afghanistan since 2005. He's served as a political affairs officer for the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, and he also previously worked as the country director for International Crisis Group. Before that, he was a journalist for a number of years and spent some time in Kandahar. We have Haroon Harimi, who is an assistant professor of law at the American University of Afghanistan. He's also a visiting professor at Università Bocconi, I think that's the way you pronounce it, and former visiting research fellow at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies. We have Tara Moayed, who is a social development consultant, and she's worked across 4 continents, but she worked in Afghanistan from 2014 to 2019, and she was an advisor in the Ministry of Finance, where she helped develop national programs for women's economic empowerment and community development. And then we also have Jordan Kane, who is a senior analyst in the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, or as you may know, at SIGAR, and she is in their Lessons Learned program. And she has worked on with extensive field experience, not just in Afghanistan, but in Rwanda, South Sudan, and Yemen. And I'm your host. I'm a research fellow at the Quincy Institute. I'm also a veteran of Afghanistan, and I'll be acting as the moderator today. And so we're at the 1-year mark, and I think there's been a lot of focus looking back, and we're going to do that a little bit today. But I want to start by looking forward and looking at the very recent past. And so I'm going to start with you, Graham. The biggest item in the news in Afghanistan, at least in the Western press, was the al-Zawahri strike. And also security and counterterrorism in Afghanistan. I think it's safe to say that's been the #1 concern of the Biden administration, even more than humanitarian issues, right or wrong. What do you think is the legacy of the al-Zawahri strike?
I think the most fundamental legacy will be mistrust. Already there was a massive gulf between the Taliban and the Western world. But I think, ultimately the #1 item on the agenda of most international actors with regards to Afghanistan is sort of, please don't hurt us. Fundamentally, it's fear of Afghanistan that drives a lot of Western policy on Afghanistan. And so, finding out that the #1 guy in al-Qaeda was hiding out on the doorstep, of the Taliban in Kabul really does kind of, I think, undermine some of the relationship between the Taliban and the West. I have to say, not just at a kind of theoretical level, but even at a personal level. I know people who have been involved with, really trying to do, hands-on diplomatic engagement with the Taliban in recent months, trying to put things back together on the humanitarian and economic front, trying to, get the central banking assets back to work for macroeconomic stability, just, bread and butter issues. And I think some of them feel personally burned, finding out that, the al-Qaeda leader was being harbored essentially by the Taliban. So yeah, it makes an already tough set of policy issues even tougher.
Yeah, and I just want to let people know that you recently had a brief that came out called, or at least International Crisis Group did, and it's called Afghanistan Security Challenges Under the Taliban. And I know you were involved in the drafting of that, and it focuses on the security lens. And Quincy Institute also has a brief out. If you go to Quincy Institute's website and you click reports, it's called, it has the same name as this panel, Strategic Patience, Sustainable Engagement with the Changed Afghanistan. So I want to get into the bread and butter issues. And I guess I'll give my 30,000 foot assessment. I agree with you that the fact that al-Zawahiri was living in Kabul combined with the strike has burned some bridges. And I think it's this perfect storm, and a lot of different stakeholders have blamed the dysfunction in Afghanistan and any one issue. And so far as the humanitarian disaster and the economic issues, I think it's just there's so many causes, it's difficult to point to one. Yes, there's the chilling effect of the sanctions, in spite of the general licenses that offer some exemptions to them. Yes, there's the fact that the central bank can't function if its foreign exchange reserves are frozen. Yes, there's the fact that the war economy came to an end overnight. We have an unprecedented sanctions situation in which a group that was designated as a terrorist group is now the de facto government. We have the rapid slowdown of aid after the collapse, and then it restarted, but it's become difficult. But at the same time, I think we also have to remember that if tomorrow the sanctions were lifted and the frozen foreign exchange reserves were returned, and aid increased, we'd still have a landlocked country that doesn't have the infrastructure for rapid economic growth, and doesn't have much industry, and doesn't really have much of an economy, has a dysfunctional relationship with its neighbors, and is subjected to the Taliban's governance or lack of governance. So I kind of wanted to bring in Tara for that. Maybe you could tell us about your past work in Afghanistan in terms of aid and services delivery when you were in Afghanistan, how that worked, what were the barriers then and the lessons learned then, and then maybe we can talk about how that impacts today.
Sure, thank you. I mean, in terms of the lessons learned, maybe I'll leave that to Jordan and the work that her team has done, which probably summarizes it much better than anyone has really been able to. But I think in terms of looking at Afghanistan today, I think it's very easy for all of us to throw the baby out with the bathwater and kind of say that, when we look at what's happened now, clearly nothing worked. But that's really not the case. And I think Afghanistan had a lot of small successes, which we should not be ignoring now, and looking at the capacity of the state to deliver basic services and reach a population living across very difficult geographic terrain with insecurity and all the other challenges, of course, corruption, low capacity issues, etc. The ability of the Afghan state to deliver so much infrastructure, provide teacher salaries across 34 provinces to the most remote and rural corners of the country, deliver healthcare across 34 provinces, and a wide range of services that even today we see are continuing through the work of the small G government and the bureaucracy that still remains, is really critical. And I think it's important to acknowledge and understand what parts of that system actually did work and are worth preserving, because it's still 20 years of investments that the international community has made. And these systems are huge assets for Afghanistan, and they're going to be needed. They can help us deliver services to people now, even in the humanitarian and basic needs context. They're going to be really critical, because it was never the UN, delivering basic services in Afghanistan. The UN was very, very small over the last 20 years for the most part of it. Their budget was, I think, maybe a couple $100 million per year, the total operating budget of all the UN agencies for humanitarian development combined. So nothing comparable to the size and scale of the service delivery that was done on budget and through government delivery. So I think it's really important to acknowledge those sectors that really there were huge successes. And from I think broadly the health program, Sadmendi, which is now there's some attempt to restart it, but not in its old shape, and the community development program and also the education service delivery are really big successes, and it would be at a huge loss for Afghanistan to lose the capacity to deliver those services going forward as well.
So what was the model for services and aid delivery? Because I think a lot of people hear about the amount of aid that gets delivered to Afghanistan, and they have no idea how either the aid or the services actually reaches the Afghan people. So can you break that down for folks?
Definitely. I mean, for the health and community development programs in Afghanistan, a really great system was set up where there was an excellent partnership between the government and NGOs and civil society to deliver these services across the country. So the government played this function with the support through IRTF and the World Bank financing, the IRTF financing from all the donors, to provide a sector-wide approach model where they financed specific sectors, and the government had either a project implementation team, or even in some ministries like education, civil servant staff who then delivered those services outside of the government. For health and community development, the government played a function of kind of overall monitoring and the regulatory function. And they contracted out the delivery by provinces to NGOs, who then delivered based on a standard set of norms and trainings and processes that were uniform across the country. So this ensured, for example, geographic equity and balance, avoided one province getting funded by two different donors and another province not getting any funding. So there was a model of actually working together with NGOs to create a more systematic approach to delivering these frontline and basic services. And I mean, in the education sector, and you had obviously the government paying the teacher salaries across the country for 260,000 different employees directly. You had a payroll system, which, yes, I mean, you also look at the MEC report that was done, I think in 2016, that highlighted a lot of the corruptions in the sector. But even today, UNICEF trying to deliver education and support the payments of teachers is relying on the database that was created inside the Ministry of Education. Similarly, UNICEF financing the health sector now, it's those same health units that were financed under the SADMENDI and through the oversight of the government.
So two questions. Obviously, some Afghan NGOs still exist, but many don't exist because the civil society, much of the civil society fled after the Taliban takeover. Of course, there's also international NGOs that are still in Afghanistan. Is community-driven development still possible under the Taliban? And related to that, you sort of are describing this parallel system of services and aid delivery that's related to the government, but parallel to it. And does the fact that this parallel system of delivery, does the fact that was in place kind of offer some potential solutions for continuing it, even in light of the Taliban takeover?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, first, I think in terms of the NGOs, the issue you have is not so much the NGOs not being present, but rather new NGOs popping up that maybe are looking for opportunities to make some profits out of the availability of funding off budget, and maybe with limited sets of controls in place by various groups. But in terms of the feasibility of community development, absolutely. So many of the NGOs who were working through communities and with communities over the past 20 years are still very active in the country and continue to work directly with communities. Obviously, and there's geographic variances, but they've had to change the way that they work. So, for example, in the past, where funding was going directly to CDC bank accounts, that seems less feasible at the moment. There's some exceptions to that. Some organizations are continuing to do that, but broadly speaking, the type of role that communities are playing are a little bit different. But in terms of their participation and their active engagement, in terms of working together with organizations on beneficiary selection, identification, ensuring equitable approaches, operations and maintenance of basic infrastructure. When Badakhshan, we had reports that throughout the winter, CDCs were working on snow clearing, for example. They're continuing to rehabilitate basic infrastructure like microhydro, providing local level energy, and various other work. So they're extremely active, and many organizations and even UN agencies continue to work with CDCs specifically and communities, of course, more broadly. In terms of a parallel structure, I mean, I wouldn't call the partnership that existed in the health and community development programs as a parallel structure. What it offers is that I think there's the opportunity to ring fence the service delivery architecture a little bit and continue to leverage it without having funding running through the Ministry of Finance and the Afghan state as it is right now. For example, I mean, when you look at what was done in Yemen, where a similar program with projects that were actually also financed through World Bank trust funds and various other donor projects, the project teams were separated out from the state and they were financed through a UN umbrella, but the implementation and delivery was continued through these technocrats that were sitting previously in the Yemeni government, and then the fiscal side of it and the fund flow was moved into the UN, but the architecture for that service delivery remained what was inside the Afghan state. So I think a very similar thing can and should be considered for Afghanistan, but unfortunately, that is not the approach that has so far been chosen by the UN and the World Bank in terms of how they're going to continue these service delivery architectures.
Graham, in terms of ring fencing and the Taliban themselves, in your assessment, how open are they to that? Do they understand that there's benefits to allowing aid and services to reach the people, even if they're cordoned off from it to some extent?
Yeah, they see us coming. They know what we're trying to do, and they're not going to let us do it. When I visited Kabul, I got long lectures about the evils of parallel structures from Taliban officials. Some of those Taliban officials, have experience in government, have experience in the UN even. They, seem to understand that that some parts of the international community would prefer to see a sort of giant-sized Gaza created in Afghanistan, and they're not having any of it. Which is why I think you saw us running into trouble with something called the Humanitarian Exchange Facility, which is kind of a bright idea for, helping with the availability of US dollars in the currency market in Kabul. It seemed like a smart idea to me. It seemed like a smart idea to a lot of Western experts, but the Taliban didn't like it. Part of the reason why they didn't like it was that they were worried about losing control of macroeconomic stability, like that having the currency supply out of the hands of state officials, wasn't something that they were all that interested in doing. They knew that, having outsiders run their currency would, decrease their power. And so they blocked it. The HEF is essentially dead, even though people keep talking about it. And so, I think that's a lesson. Not that the Taliban are disinterested in economic recovery, because they're very interested in economic recovery, but they're interested in doing it on their own terms. And so I think the lesson of that should be that we, the West, need to sit down and talk to them about how we're going to do, development planning, because, as we've seen with the HEF, as we will see with a number of other, situations, just trying to impose these things unilaterally from the outside is just not going to work. And in any country in the situation, there would be a development plan. The trouble is that the sort of high-level negotiations for creating such a plan are, shall we say, fraught. There's still limitations on the ability of Western governments, even multilateral actors like the World Bank, are under some constraints in terms of how they can engage at a high level with the Taliban and have those conversations about what's going to happen next. And I have to say, we really need to get over our own compunctions about this, because what we're asking the internationals to do is just illogical. Like, we want the state to be self-sufficient. We want the state to raise revenues and pay for its own services. And so if you try to keep the Taliban-controlled state from making money, that's just not going to work. You can't just deliver aid completely in parallel with the state and hope that the state will somehow magically become self-sufficient. I think that a really good example of this is the CASA 1000 project, probably one of the sort of best options on the table for helping the Afghan economy to recover, not just Afghanistan but also the region. Connecting energy-rich Central Asia with energy-poor South Asia. If those electricity corridors get built, that's going to result in tens of millions of dollars pouring into the Taliban treasury, because that'll be completely legitimate fees being paid to the Afghan state. And so the idea of ring fencing, of helping the Afghan people without helping the Taliban, these are ridiculous slogans, and we really need to stop it, because otherwise we can't get on with the hard, practical negotiations that need to happen.
And just to be clear, the reason those fees would be legitimate is due to General License 20 that allows certain fees related to commercial transactions, like the customs duties, like the taxes, like the licensing. That general license has opened up some fees to reach the Taliban.
That general license makes such fees legal in the eyes of the US government. But I have to say, General License 20 has not been copied by other countries. So, my country, Canada, which is also Tara's country, the Canadian government, for example, has not followed the American example and made, those kinds of forms of direct support to the Afghan state legal again. So, there is a problem, I think, around the world with sort of getting over this this hurdle of, allowing the Afghan state to be self-sufficient.
So we've gone straight into the technicalities and the details and the weeds, and I think we need to back up for a second, and I want to bring Haroon in for this. I want to ask a more fundamental question to you, Haroon, as an Afghan. How do you think Western countries and the international community as a whole walks this tightrope of allowing development and facilitating development in Afghanistan, but not totally giving in to the Taliban? I mean, there's a lot of conflicting priorities here. On the one hand, the Taliban want control, but they don't really have the leverage or the resources to demand that. On the other hand, as Graham has pointed out, the international community wants self-sufficiency on the part of Afghanistan, which, by the way, wasn't achieved by the Republic. But they don't want to necessarily embolden or empower or legitimize the Taliban. And then the Afghan people are caught in the middle of all of this, kind of between a rock and a hard place. How do we deal with that?
So that's a very good question. But let me, before speaking to that question, I make a couple of comments that I think are related. First, on Zawahiri's the drone strike against Zawahiri, the legacy of their drone strike. I think one maybe underreported aspect of it is the tension that it introduced in the relation between Taliban and Pakistan. The supreme leader held an important gathering in Kandahar, basically calling out Pakistan and cautioning them against allowing their airspace to be used against Afghanistan in the future. The defense minister made similar remarks. And that is crucial because there is possibly an unannounced kind of series of attacks by the Pakistanis inside Afghanistan against TTP members, given that the peace process with the TTP doesn't seem to be going as fast as many hoped it would. And I say that because Afghanistan has a lot of issues with its neighbors as well. So it's not just West, quote unquote. And when we think about, okay, well, how can Afghanistan kind of transition out of this? And that's a question of economy. And I think there are three things that need to happen. One is that Afghanistan has to find a way to be part of the international community. That would require for Taliban to understand what it takes at minimum, and that also the international community to basically answer the question of what it wants from Afghanistan. Because right now, my view is that in the past, because we can get to technicality as how things have changed since Taliban came to power or not. In the past, a lot of risk was tolerated because the international community believed they were investing in a vision of Afghanistan that they wanted to see succeed. Now, they are have a very low risk tolerance when it comes to Afghanistan because they believe that any success would contribute to a vision of Afghanistan that they don't want to see succeed. Because if Taliban vision of the country succeed, that is, I think, normatively something the international community wouldn't, West here, cannot really tolerate in a sense. So you see, they want Afghanistan to be self-sustaining and self-sufficient, true, but no country is value neutral, right? Afghanistan is going to succeed as a republic or as emirate, and depends what you mean by succeed. If by succeed means the government has enough to pay salary of the people they hire, yeah, I think they both can succeed in those terms under different circumstances. But if there's going to be international investment in that country, I think it comes with serious normative underpinnings, that kind of questions, and I don't that kind of investments. And I don't think the world has decided that. I think the West has decided. So now they're trying to walk, as you said, this tightrope of, okay, we're going to give money to the extent that it would contribute to a progressive Afghanistan, but we're going to cut up the money in a way that would not make Afghanistan become a successful emirate for the Taliban. And it's not, there's one Afghanistan, really, you cannot do both things at the same time. There is one Afghanistan, it has one government, one de facto authority in charge. Like it or not, they are in charge to separate the question of service delivery, economy, governance, and all of that and say, okay, we're going to exist in this polar world and just, it doesn't work. What you can achieve, obviously, possibly, is to avoid famine, but that gets to the issue of UN role. You can do that at a very high cost. I mean, I know Graham said that the corridor is dead, but that transferred $1 billion into Afghanistan. And that's the money that went physically into the country. You have to realize that UN pays a lot of people outside the country that wouldn't go through that. So we are looking at a couple of $1 billion bill. What was achieved in Afghanistan? I don't think anyone can tell me what was achieved in Afghanistan over the past year in terms of how effective that money was. And it's not a complicated thing. Pick up any book on aid industry or aid economy. They will tell you that it's very expensive compared to the economy. And it can achieve very little sustainable change in any country. I mean, it is kind of established in the literature that's the case. So what would happen in Afghanistan? What would take for Afghanistan to actually move towards something that make the place livable for its people is for Afghanistan to become a stable place. In that case, I think not aid, but economic investment could become a possibility. And I think many countries in the region would like that to happen as well. But that would require Taliban to figure out a way to coexist in the international community and address the legitimate concerns of their countries in the neighbor. Will they do that? Honestly, the court is it is within their control. I cannot really say they can or cannot, or they would or would not. With regard to the question, sorry, it took me a little bit to get to the question of Afghanistan and what should be, how should we walk this rope, kind of this tightrope. As I tell you, I don't see that's possible. And I don't think Taliban are, because they're also trying to walk a very tight rope of, for example, being not completely breaking ties with al-Qaeda and at the same time becoming a member of the international community, having sanctions removed, having their central bank that they control connect with the international banking system. They cannot have it both ways either. I think both sides have very difficult questions to ask themselves and answer, and neither of them is ready to answer those questions.
Thanks for that answer, Haroon. And I'd like to shout out an article by Andrew Watkins that was in the August edition of the CTC Sentinel called "The Taliban 1 Year On." It's a deep dive into sort of the inner dynamics of the Taliban in their first year of power that, because you referenced some of those dynamics, if listeners want to go deeper into the weeds, I think that's a good place to start. But I want to ask you one follow-up, which is, in your view, and I know there's a diverse view among Afghans and you're just one Afghan, but in your view, what do you think is the bigger risk? Is it that Afghanistan turns into a failed state because the international community tries to walk this tightrope and fails at doing it, which you've predicted there would be a failure if they try that, or that the international community approaches Afghanistan as a single entity, sort of accepts the reality of the de facto Taliban authorities and but potentially empowers the Taliban a little bit. In other words, the Taliban becomes successful.
I know if you ask people on the ground, and ordinary Afghans, my entire family still lives in the country, extended family included. Many of them would tell you that if you ask them, like, what is their issue on their mind, economy is number one. They want to have a way to live in the country, given the trial they face if they choose to leave, and many would not like to leave. So they see that as, I think the West may see the option of engaging, not engaging, investing, not investing. People in the country don't have that luxury. They cannot ignore the reality like many other outsiders can, including the Afghan diaspora. which they can choose to ignore the reality of Afghanistan and see Afghanistan in a very narrow way. People on the ground would like the economy to succeed. They would like to see their girls go back to school. So I think in terms of what are the risks, I think there are great risks on both sides. I think the risk of failure to actually to take action to prevent Afghanistan from becoming completely a failed state, which is, I think, a lot of them is within the control of actors outside of Afghanistan, is that those people going to have no way to earn a livelihood, and they're going to fall into misery even more than they have so far. And on the other side, if the Taliban fail to figure out a way to rule in the benefit of the people, some give and take, allow that for it to happen, and be reasonable and rational in terms of what is possible if they want Afghanistan economy to actually stand on its own, or have actually way to people to earn a living, then the cost would be that the many people would be forced into misery. So I think there are great risks for people in government in Afghanistan today and international community continuing on the same path they are on. And I think the cost is going to be borne by ordinary Afghan. And as you pointed out, I think early on, none of those actions unilaterally can solve the problem. That is the issue of diplomacy. Like, you have to coordinate, you have to figure out a common way forward, given the reality and the oneness of Afghanistan in mind, meaning it's the one reality. You cannot have anyone having their own idea of what the country is, ignoring the facts.
Okay, thank you for that. I think really forthright answer. We've talked about the Taliban as a stakeholder. We've talked about NGOs as a stakeholder. We've talked about the international community writ large as a stakeholder. But now I want to talk about the United States itself. So, Jordan, how has U.S. assistance to Afghanistan changed since August 2021, both in magnitude and type?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's been dramatic. Donor aid previously constituted 80% of public expenditures in the country, and the U.S. was the biggest donor to the Afghan government, propping up that government through aid, propping up the security forces through aid. But after the collapse of that previous government, obviously, aid fell sharply. It's difficult to overstate, as others have said, the magnitude of the current economic crisis, humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. In January, the UN announced 2 appeals for Afghan aid that totaled more than $8 billion, one of which was the largest appeal for a single country in UN history. And the World Food Program projects that almost 19 million Afghans will face acute food insecurity between June and November 22. However, the US remains the largest single donor of aid to Afghanistan, and our government has provided $775 million in contributions since last August. But this is dramatically less than the US was providing under the previous regime. And it's also narrowly focused on what we define as humanitarian assistance, basic services. All US government funding is programmed through the UN or through implementing partners, meaning it's no longer going on budget to education, for example. US funding is definitely keeping some basic services on life support, but just barely, I would say. In October and November, the USAID and other donors provided bridge funding to sustain Setup Mandi, the public health program. And then in October, USAID issued a 3-year roadmap to continue to address the healthcare crisis through December 24. But since the return of the Taliban to power, USAID's education assistance, for example, has largely stopped. And that's because, exactly as Tara said, it was flowing through the former Afghan government. That's not just because of concerns about girls being stopped from going to school. There are other concerns, such as the concern about the Taliban turning schools into madrasas. The limited remaining education aid now focuses on a very few specific uses. I think girls' tertiary scholarships are one of them, providing informal community-based education. And there's sort of a number of other smaller pots of money, demining, and I think Mercy Corps has a livelihoods program.
So it's interesting because since the fall of the former Afghan government and the Taliban take over the country, I've said over and over again, we shouldn't disengage from Afghanistan. We shouldn't repeat the mistakes of the 1990s. But look, $775 million is not disengagement. And so I've been, I don't think it's fair to say the US has disengaged. So that's why I've sort of hesitated to say that, because that's considerable aid. But Graham, I actually want to ask you this question. I mean, the engagement has changed. We're sending tons of money, but we're not really, you spoke about this earlier, we're not able to engage with the Taliban authorities that exist in a way that seems to produce any kind of results. How much of that falls on US diplomacy and how much of that falls on Taliban intransigence?
I mean, it's a lot of both. There's a lot of frustration, I think, on both sides of the talks between the U.S. and the Taliban, for example, on the frozen assets. And it's a matter of some debate amongst economists. Who's to say what part of the economic crisis is a result of existing U.S. sanctions and being allowed to sort of migrate over to become, de facto sanctions on the entire country. What part is the shut off of development aid? What part is just kind of the chilling effect? I mean, when I talk to a bank CEO and he says, I have $30 million stranded with Citibank and they won't pick up my phone calls because they fear US sanctions, that's not a direct US policy. That's just sort of the indirect, climate of fear amongst, businesses that occurs when listed terrorists take over an entire country. But I think it's worth emphasizing that, we're not talking about a flood or an earthquake. I mean, the people of Afghanistan, the reason the economy has collapsed and continues to really suffer is not because there's been some kind of a natural disaster. This really is a man-made crisis, and some of the men are in Washington, D.C., and some of the men are in Kabul. Some are in Kandahar, some are in Berlin. But it's not. It doesn't have to be this way. And I think it's worth reading the latest World Bank economic update. There are some glimmers of hope there. The government revenues for the current year have now surpassed government revenues for the same period last year when the Republic was collecting revenues, in part because the Taliban have cleaned up corruption massively. And so there are ways in which I think the Taliban are trying to sort of duct tape things back together, even though the country, does remain under a lot of pressure. And about a third of the GDP has disappeared since this time last year. So we're talking about a grim new normal that is emerging economically.
Tara, first of all, you look like you want to say something, so please say whatever you want to say. But I also have a question for you, which is that Jordan talked about the reduction in aid for girls' education, and that it's basically these tertiary programs probably outside of the country and so forth. There's like this chicken and the egg argument that the Taliban engage in, and I think they engage in it disingenuously, in which they'll say, well, we don't have the resources for education. But I think it's also quite obvious that if they just lifted the ban, they would have the resources for education, although maybe I'm wrong about that. They'll also say things like, well, girls are allowed to school in 19 provinces or what have you. But they won't address the fact that there's still this blanket ban, including in the most populous city in the country. And so it really becomes circular with them. How in addition to whatever else you want to say, how do you think the former, the countries that have traditionally provided aid to Afghanistan can deal with this issue? Is there a way to aid education in that kind of environment?
Yes, thanks. I'm sorry. I just first want to address Graham's point as well. I mean, I think a huge issue when it comes to service delivery is also raising the question of what is the Taliban doing to provide services to its population right now? And this is a bit of a black hole at the moment. So when Graham says there's no corruption, and I know a lot of other analysts are using that narrative. Personally, coming from the Ministry of Finance, I have some issues with that because they're collecting this revenue, which, okay, questionable if it's more or less. It's actually the numbers are lower in terms of total amounts being collected. But regardless, it's a significant amount of money. I believe the latest World Bank estimates are something like 1.7 billion for this fiscal year. will be collected in revenues, but we have no idea where that money is going. There's not been a single report of where a dollar of expenditure from the Taliban's revenues has gone. So, you can say there's less corruption, but when you actually have no idea what's happening to the entire pool of funding of revenues, that to me is a bit questionable. So I think, first of all, the onus for the provision of services, the Taliban have to be held accountable for it. And it's not just in the education sector where they're banning girls from going to school, but also in terms of the financing for civil servants, the payment of civil servant salaries, and where is all that revenue supposedly that they are reporting on, that they increase in customs revenue, where's the money going and how is it being spent? And I think that's a really key question that donors aren't asking the Taliban, or not sufficiently looking at to what extent they're subsidizing the basic functions that the Taliban can in fact be paying for from the revenues that they're raising. So that would be the number one point. And I think in the education sector, it's a trade-off. I certainly do not have an answer to it, but there's a trade-off between Western countries coming in and financing and paying for teacher salaries when the Taliban in fact can be paying for those salaries through state revenues. And to what extent are you then making the country more dependent and creating a humanitarian alibi essentially for the Taliban to not be required to pay for basic services for its own population? So I think, looking at the actual revenue numbers and in the past what the Afghan state was able to finance from its own revenues, the salaries of teachers and civil servants should be able to be covered by the state revenues, and their lack of information on that is a huge problem. And the other point is, just to be clear, I mean, when we talk about service delivery through the state, because of this lack of transparency on where funding is going, I think it would be very difficult, not just because of sanctions, for aid agency, for donors to put money through the state, but also that there doesn't seem to be any desire by the current administration to finance these services. So the funding that was available, there's no clarity on where it's gone and how this is serving the needs of Afghans. So for me, as a development person, much not at all a political person, the key question I have is if you were even to consider financing something through the state structures, there's no certainty and no willingness, it seems, to actually get that money to deliver the services. So even though the architecture for service delivery used to be in the state, I think it's important for me to again underline the fact that the financial flows should be outside of the state, because the Afghan administration has not demonstrated any willingness to be transparent about its finances and where the money's going and its ability to actually spend on those services.
Yeah, I guess what I'd also add is that nepotism is corruption's cousin, and the Taliban are certainly infected by nepotism and incompetence as a result of nepotism. But Graham, do you have any response to that? Is it a mistake to, in some sense, I mean, given that money is fungible, is it a mistake to perhaps subsidize the Taliban by providing aid for services that, like girls' education, that they should really be providing on their own?
I mean, obviously, Tara's critique of the lack of transparency is absolutely correct. And it is troubling that the Taliban have not provided a national budget, because I think any country that is so incredibly dependent on outside assistance, should pay the respect to the donors and actually tell them, how the money is being spent overall. And it makes sense to me. That being said, these claims that the Taliban are less corrupt, this is not guesswork. This is science. Dr. David Mansfield and his colleagues have spent a huge amount of money counting trucks going through customs points and a huge amount of time interviewing truckers. The UN has held roundtables with business people. This is, we know for sure the Taliban are dramatically less corrupt than the previous Afghan government by a huge factor. And I think that in and of itself, when you talk to ordinary Afghans about, their experience of the new government, that is something that they will talk to you about the fact that, policemen are not shaking them down at gunpoint for Afghanis as much as occurred previously. I'm not saying there has been, there's no corruption under the current regime. That's obviously not the case. It's just the lived experience of Afghans of the new government is dramatically different. And so when we hammer the Taliban for their lack of transparency, and we absolutely should, we need to keep in mind that the previous government was itself not a model of transparency.
Jordan, you have your hand up.
All right, it might help if I unmuted myself. I just wanted to say, I don't even think that I share concerns about if we were to put money directly onto the Taliban's budget, which I think is, pretty unrealistic, not really being suggested, that it would allow the Taliban to divert money towards what they want to spend money on that we don't: security forces, intelligence, these sorts of things. But I also think that the current purported division between sort of political or potentially political development aid and apolitical humanitarian aid, which is a line that we've seen the US draw in the sand, and I'm sure other countries do too in other country contexts, is overly simplistic. We absolutely have already seen plenty of examples of the Taliban trying to use humanitarian assistance for political gain. For example, CIGAR's reported on Taliban attempts to redirect US assistance to families of their soldiers. So I just wanted to add that sort of additional complexity. And that's something that Lessons Learned is planning to take a look at in the future. I've seen the US government do that in South Sudan as well. For example, there was a freeze at one point on anything development.
And actually on that note, CIGAR is still very active. They're not just looking backwards. I think it's safe to say they're looking forward. So what is Lessons Learned looking into right now?
Sure, we're still answering, we're still coming to the end of a series of questions that Congress asked immediately after the fall of the Afghan government, including what were the main factors contributing to the fall of the Afghan security forces. My team did a report on the allegations of theft on the helicopters that President Ghani flew out with, which I can't say that I was that satisfied with our answer to. But we're also proposing forward-looking projects, including this one about delivering aid to populations under hostile governments or extremely corrupt governments, which is, I think, a similar set of problems. Or even in insurgent-controlled areas, sometimes you see that a development funding will be frozen in a particular region of a country. And that report will obviously focus on the challenges of working in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, but we anticipate that its findings will be relevant to a diverse country set from Yemen to South Sudan. And we'll examine the challenge of defining the strategy behind the ongoing aid, which is, I think, what we're discussing here. Is the goal to stave off famine? Is it to retain some semblance of public health? Or is it bigger? Is it something like keeping Afghanistan from becoming a failed state? And I don't pretend to have the answer to that. While donors, I think I discussed this differentiation between apolitical humanitarian aid and potentially political or certainly political development aid. And then we'll look at operational constraints as well. How do you measure effectiveness of your programming in such a restricted environment, which is, like a number of these challenges, just being carried over from the previous government to this one, I think, maybe to a different degree. And finally, we'll look at these legal barriers that we've touched on in this conversation. What is actually happening, vice what are the left and right limits technically in terms of how money can move, and not just humanitarian or development assistance, but also commercial transactions, because the lack of willingness to engage with Afghanistan has really put a pall on the commercial sector as well.
Yeah, and by the way, on that last note, I was in Pakistan like a month and a half ago, and I talked to someone familiar with the Pakistani banking sector, and I said, look, are Pakistani banks willing to finance transactions in Afghanistan given the general licenses? And they basically said no, they don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. Haroon, there was something mentioned by Jordan, which is like, what are the goals? Is the goal just to stave off famine, or is the goal to prevent a failed state? If I understand your earlier comments, I guess you'd suggest those are, I guess, mutually exclusive, and that you can't prevent the famine if you allow Afghanistan to become a failed state. But maybe I'm wrong. So correct me if I'm
You're
wrong.
absolutely right. I think Jordan has also pointed out correctly into the idea of these bifurcation that could exist in our head does not exist in reality. So if you have people who don't have enough to eat, right, and you say, okay, we're going to make sure that the public health sector is working. Go look at the malnutrition division within the hospitals, right? That is a result of the country's economy being having a choke on it, right? You can pay maybe salaries of doctors, but are you solving the malnutrition problem in Afghanistan? If you look at the mortality rate for pregnant women and childbirth, I mean, if you don't have an economy and people have to decide who they feed, and obviously women and pregnant women need a lot more to sustain themselves, those tend to get deprioritized, and you have more. I'm just saying, like, it is not possible to separate these things. And with regards to the education, I think it is important to keep in mind why the world is saying we pay for education if you allow girls to go to school. The choice of education is not because international assistance is needed for girls' education. The choice is because I think the donor countries, the voters in those countries, see that as the right investment, as a right thing to pay for, as opposed to development project, as opposed to other projects where maybe international assistance may be better suited. Even it will be better, maybe easier to actually monitor on those kind of investments. And I think the Taliban can afford to pay the girls, to pay the civil sector, including the education sector, and they do. I mean, you said the UNICEF, Jordan pointed out that because of all the problem in the education sector, that those fundings are in pause. But my uncle teaches, two of my uncles teach, my aunt teaches in school, and they get paid. The salaries go through, so there is someone paying them, maybe not as regularly, but they do get paid. So it reflects this fact that we are trying to save some of the Afghanistan and let the other Afghanistan destroy, or save some and let kind of pressure others to make sure that it does not succeed, and those come to a head. And I think that points to this fundamental problem of incongruities that exist, both the way that the West sees Afghanistan and the Taliban wish to govern Afghanistan. As I said, they're both on a path that are not going to work, simply not going to work, and the status quo is also not sustainable. So both, as I said earlier, there are difficult questions that neither side have been willing to ask themselves and answer, and everyone is thinking that we can find a kind of this technical, innovative, like reimagine the aid or development, and then the solution appears. I don't think that's possible.
And I also think we have to remember that whether they see it as leverage or whether this is because they're for ideological reasons, the Taliban have chosen to isolate themselves, and by extension Afghanistan, by not moving forward on girls' education. And you know, of course, they're also harming their own country by not developing, you know, in half their population. But aside from that fact, and the human rights of the girls, which should be, you know, front and center, they've chosen to undermine their own position. How do you work with a group like that, Haroon?
I think so. First, you have to understand why they did this. First of all, I think if you look at the core of what happened in Kandahar, the best we can tell was that there were some religious scholars who argued that there is no right to modern education beyond basic religious education that every human being, every Muslim needs to learn so they can practice their faith. That they believe could be achieved in primary school and in masjids, in mosques, and by family members. Beyond that, they don't say it's banned in Islam. They say it's permissible, and that's why they say we're not against girls' education. But they believe that when something's permissible, the ruler can restrict it if the ruler believes there is moral risks or the risk of moral corruption. And those religious scholars around the Taliban Sukuran leaders are not convinced yet that there are things in place, conditions in place that would allow for girls to go to school in beyond primary school in a way that would minimize those moral risks to the extent that they are willing to accept. For example, ideas like they wanted to have like a exclusive transportation system, get rid of all the male in the education system, redesign the curriculum because of all. So those are the thinking going there. I don't think international community demand that this has to happen figured heavily in those calculations. I honestly think there was esoteric, parochial visions of those in Kandahar who do not think in terms of international appeasement who drove that decision. I think Taliban internal politics might have the role to play. There's divisions that some pro-engagement and some would rather to preserve the authenticity and purity of the movement. And that also is something to keep in mind, that a lot of people say the Taliban want international recognition. That is not entirely true, because Taliban, and even if you look at the religious kind of pedigree, Deobandis came out as a rejection of foreign kind of invasion, and that was not just military invasion; it was also cultural invasion. So international appeasement is a cost to them, religiously, ideologically. So doing what the international community demands of them is not seen as a win for those core leadership in Kabul, in Kandahar. It is actually a cost. Standing to the international community, standing your ground against international pressure would boost their credentials among the circles that share their views of the world and ideology. So thinking, as you said, it's kind of shooting themselves in the foot. I think that they don't see it that way. They see it as we stood on the ground, we have our own principles, we figure out how we can do it, and once we're satisfied, we'll do it on our own terms. But as you pointed out, it came at a huge cost for the population of Afghanistan, because these cost decisions are made by a very small circle. And I would say that number one thing you hear from Afghans, maybe close to the economy or maybe right after the economy, is girls' education. Because it's a matter of girls being at home and their parents and having to witness the trauma that they're experiencing, and many people choosing to leave. It's not an abstract idea of human rights. It's just literally girls crying at homes, and families have to find a way to deal with that.
Thanks for that, Haroon. I'm going to take this panel a few minutes over, only because I think this, where we're at, deserves a little more time. So those who can stay. Tara, there's on the subject of girls' education, and I think it's safe to say that so far as the international community goes, the 2 points of tension are the counterterrorism issue and the girls' education issue. That's my assessment, at least. But in terms of where, so far as girls' education, there's still provinces where it's happening. And my understanding is the provinces where the secondary girls' education is happening is due to the community demands itself, and the fact that the Taliban had to respond to the community demands. Is that a testament to grassroots community-led development versus this top-down development model that we saw over the last 20 years? And if so, how do we deal with that? Like, how does that inform Western policies?
Absolutely, that's great question, Adam. Yes, 100%. I mean, I think it's unfortunate, but oftentimes when we talk about development and the current context in Afghanistan, we forget that Afghans themselves in Afghanistan, the community members, the rural people living in the villages, as an actor in their own fate and what's happening to them. And of course, the context is difficult. So particularly, for women's rights activists and civil society activists and journalists, the context is extremely challenging and difficult. And I don't want to in any way suggest that they, with all of their excellent attempts, they're able to really sway the Taliban one way or another. But there is something to be said about broad public opinion and demands from the communities at large for very basic services and needs, where they do find the spaces. And often it is in the South and the East where traditionally the communities were perhaps more aligned with some of the ideals of the current regime, where we're seeing communities actually being able to come up and vocalize their demands for very basic services. And that's being responded to for various reasons. Again, this really varies from parts of the country. So one is that where we see communities demanding certain types of services, so like education, and one is where the dynamics of the political situation is such that the communities are able to leverage some sort of a power over the Taliban that's controlling that particular area. So there's huge variations in the country. But I think the more that we can actually involve communities directly in the development process, give them a voice, give them decision-making power and transparency. It's not just about the Taliban being transparent, but the aid being transparent. Right now, communities don't know how much money is going in for food aid, who's receiving it, based on what requirements. Even if the beneficiary selection is done perfectly by an organization, and complete kudos to WFP for the scale of the work and the amount of aid it's been able to deliver at such a quick time. I don't want to, undermine the amazing work of the humanitarian agencies, but we've seen reports from Afghan Analyst Network that the UN itself produced a report a few months ago about just to the extent that communities are raising questions about the fairness of aid. And that's not necessarily issues with even the distribution methodology, but about the fact they don't have a say in it. They don't have a voice. They don't feel involved because there's no information going back to them about what's happening in their country, who's paying for what, who's entitled to what. And I think their shift of focus is required by aid agencies as well, in terms of making those communities a part of the process, because that will make it much easier to operate. Because at the end of the day, they're the ones that want and need the services. So they'll be the ones that will voice and echo this demand for the service as well, to make the lives of the agencies more manageable in terms of negotiating access and non-interference in basic things like procurement and recruitment with the de facto authorities.
Jordan, do you have any reaction to that as someone who's spent, I'm sure, hundreds, if not thousands of hours looking at aid accountability and transparency?
Yeah, I would just say David Mansfield was in our lessons learned program not that long ago, so good to hear that shout out. But I share the concerns that Tara raised about the food aid, and many concerns that have been expressed about whether that's going to particular communities and lack of transparency about where it's going as well. I think passports are another great example of a place where the Taliban have a huge corruption problem. I think the going rate realistically of a passport right now is about $1,000 because they're not accessible without going through a broker. And I know that there have been crackdowns by the Taliban against those brokers or those corrupt officials, but those are examples that keep me up at night. I don't know if that exactly answered your question, except to validate the concern.
No, it answered it. So sometimes there's not an answer. And I think that's what we have to get used to going forward. Graham, I want to ask you one final question, and I know we've gone over time, but your report or crisis group's report was about security, under the Taliban, security challenges under the Taliban. Today, I think we've talked more about the stability of Afghanistan, the humanitarian situation. How are those related to security? Because I do think there's some folks in Washington, especially, who think, okay, let's do over the horizon, counterterrorism. Let's take out al-Qaeda targets, and who cares what happens to Afghanistan otherwise? Is that a realistic perspective? How is the humanitarian situation and the stability of the country related to security?
Yeah, it comes back to this this question that I think was raised by a few panelists here. It's been amazing, by the way, listening to all of you. I feel so lucky to listen to you smart people talking. It comes back to that question of like, why are we doing this? Why are we offering humanitarian aid? For what purpose? And so in some ways, the security policy and the humanitarian policy and the development policy all need to be, linked up. And it becomes very fundamental to sort of like, are we seeking stability in South Asia? Is that the idea? And it's not just in terms of, not just American policymakers who are grappling with this. We were holding some discussions with folks in New York who are working on the NAMA mandate. And I think, within those delegations, there's a fair bit of disagreement. If you look at the French delegation or the Indian delegation, for example, and you ask them like, okay, what do you want the UN to be doing in general? Are we seeking a stable situation now under the Taliban government? And they can't always give you a good, clear yes on that. And so, yeah, with security policy, it does have to be, I think, joined up to this idea of, are we, just going to poke the hornet's nest from time to time and kill some guys from the sky that who we consider to be a threat to global peace and security? Or are we going to take a more, I would argue, serious approach, a more comprehensive approach of trying to slowly build towards some gradual forms of security cooperation with the Taliban? And I say that not because I trust the Taliban necessarily on security issues. I say that because these security issues are too serious to be, treated with the fairly, I would say, unserious approaches of just, hitting things with drones from time to time, or funneling, some money and some weapons to the NRF and thinking that's going to solve anything at all. you know, I do think that a more kind of comprehensive, gradual way of saying, okay, we, for example, in the outside world would like problems not to spill across Afghanistan's borders. How are we going to do that? It'll probably involve some limited forms of border cooperation. You know, for example, you know, maybe there are measures that could be taken at airports, measures that could be taken at border points that would address, for example, proliferation issues. We don't want Afghanistan to again become a giant sort of arms bazaar, feeding militancy up into the Fergana Valley in Central Asia or over into Kashmir. So it's, you know, I think there are slow, difficult, probably oftentimes frustrating steps that will need to be taken to cooperate with the Taliban on security, rather than just pursuing these kind of failed policies of, you know, giving good guys guns and hitting bad guys from the sky.
With that, I think I'm going to have to wrap it up. There was a really good question in the Q&A. If the U.S. is by far the biggest humanitarian donor, then why are we seeing the lack of transparency and monitoring that both you and Tara spoke about? But I think I would direct that person to future reports by SIGAR and to their website, which has thousands of pages of reports. And like I said, International Crisis Group had a brief that came out. Quincy Institute had a brief that came out. So I hope some of you will go read that. As usual, I'm left thinking, whenever I host a panel on Afghanistan, I feel completely inadequate as a moderator and a host, because there's so much to get through. I wish we had 2 hours. I always feel like we scratch the surface and then we have to end things. But I think there's a lot of questions that were raised today. And the biggest question that wasn't resolved is, what is the end goal of Western and US engagement with Afghanistan? And I think that's something that's going to have to be resolved sooner rather than later. And I think it's fair to say that there's not a clear answer to that right now. And until there is a clear answer, all of the dysfunctions that our panelists were talking about are going to continue in some form, because there's not going to be a coherent policy. And I hope that changes. So anyway, thanks to all of you for sharing your experience and your knowledge, and thanks to those who stayed with us about 10 minutes over time.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.